All right, here we go. Let's jump into data collection. Now, I do want to tell you before we begin that you need to know this information. Data collection is so important in special ed. And so I'm not sure if you've been told or not, but one of the mottos of special ed is that if there's no data, it didn't happen. And so that means that if you don't have data to support your claims, your progress reports, or your progress monitoring, what you're sharing with parents or with your school district, if you don't have data to support what you say, then it's as if you never did anything and the instruction and the student's performance never happened. So it's really important that you collect data to progress monitor your students to know how they're doing, for IEP progress reports, to inform your instruction to let you know if your instruction is working or not, or if you need to make modifications to your instruction. So while this is extremely important and you have to know it, it is not going to be on a quiz. So I want to make sure I tell you that in advance. It is not going to be on a quiz. So, one of my colleagues, Dr. Robert Pennington out of the University of Kentucky, when asked about teaching, said that teaching can be said to have occurred when students' behavior changes in response to the application of instruction. So, what does that even mean? Well, what that means is when your students walk away knowing or being able to do something that they couldn't do before, that's when you know that you've really taught them. Because it's important to remember that teaching is not just an act. It is not just a verb where you are teaching. It is also an outcome. In order for for you to actually teach something, there has to be an outcome. And in our case, it's positive student outcomes. It's students learning something that they did not know or that they could not do previously. So I want to tell you that throughout our videos, there are going to be times where I'm going to ask you to stop the video and then in something like a Word document, or it could be a Google Doc that you then download and upload to Canvas, I want you to respond to these questions. I don't care if you use bullet points, if you write in paragraphs, if you're an outlining person, I don't care how you respond, but I do want you to submit those responses to Canvas. Number one, it's a way for you to engage with the content, which is going to increase your acquisition of the skills and help you to think more deeply about the content that we're teaching and that you're learning. But it will also prepare you for our class discussion. So again, you're going to hear me say, all right, I want you to stop the video now and then respond. And you're just going to keep a running list of your responses. And if you'll put the question at the top, and the question doesn't have to be exact, it can be, what is teaching to me in this case, if you forget, but to put a question, and then again, bullet points work great for me. And then you're going to upload that to Canvas. So the first question that I want you to respond to is, how do you know if you're teaching? How do you know if you're teaching? What would that look like for you? So go ahead and stop the video, write down your response, and then come back and we'll continue. All right. I also want to say you're going to see these little visuals that say like turn and talk, or it might say think, pair, share. We will use those in class, but I teach this class both in person and on op. And so I use the same video because you're getting the exact same content that they're getting in the in-person course. All right, so one of the ways when I think about how do I know if I'm teaching is that I do progress monitoring, and I'll do that with you as well. So I'll do progress monitoring to see is my teaching effective and are you learning the things that I'm trying to teach you. And so with progress monitoring, that is when we are going to be continuously conducting assessments, and you're collecting data specifically so you can assess students' progress. This is what we make instructional decisions on. All of our instructional decisions should be based on the data that we collect on our students' performance. Because that data tells you is what you're doing working, or has it already worked, or is it not working and you need to do some kind of a modification to your instruction. And so, one of the things I want you to think about when you're thinking about data collection is anyone should be able to walk into your class, look at your data, and determine how a student is performing or how they're progressing in their educational program. It could be a parent, it could be another teacher, it could be your principal. Anyone should be able to walk into your class, and in my case, because I still use hard copies, and pick up my data notebook and be able to tell what my students are doing and where they're performing. And one of the things I want to stop here because I know a lot of you are paraprofessionals. This was already in this PowerPoint though before I taught the op class. Is I just want to make sure that everyone realizes that our paraprofessionals are unsung heroes of special education. They support teachers, they support students, and they help us all reach our full potential. So when you have your own classroom, or if you're in your own classroom now, I just really want to strongly encourage you to teach your paraprofessionals to collect and to analyze data. And I'll tell you why this is important. Our paras are teachers. They are teaching our students. My paras taught math, they taught reading, they taught science. And so I taught my paras, and I encourage you to teach them to collect data. But not only that, because they are instructors, they need to be able to look at that data and analyze it and to help you as their supervisor, because we know everything our paraprofessionals are doing should be under our supervision and direction. But they should be able to sit with you and the two of you analyze that data. And they are important contributors and members of our team to determine where should we go next with our students based on the data that we've collected. And so now we're going to look at different types of assessment and the data that you would collect for those types of assessment. And so the first one we're going to talk about is free operant assessment. And I don't want you to get too stressed out or caught up in the terminology that we're using here, although it would be great if you could remember that it was free operant. But when I was in school, we called it event recording. But it's more important that you know what type of data to collect, what it is, what that data is, and what examples and or when you would use that data. So with free operant assessment, this is when the student's response, the behavior, the skill has a very clear beginning and end. It starts and it stops, and it occurs in some kind of a natural environment. And oftentimes this type of data might be count. And a lot of times with count, people think about tally marks. We're counting how many times this happened. And that might be something like a teacher using a smartphone counting app, because there are apps. I encourage you to look for apps, lots of great free apps out there, where every time a student engages, and in this case, it would be every time a student has an interaction with a peer within an hour, the teacher clicks the app and it keeps track, the count of times of those student interactions with peers. Another type of free operant assessment is rate. And with rate, we want to know how many times something happened within a specific time. So perhaps a teacher might record the number of requests for assistance, the number of times a student asked for help within a 45-minute block. So how many times did the student ask for help within our 45-minute block? And then the teacher's going to calculate the rate per minute by taking the number of times asked for help, dividing it by the number of minutes, and that'll tell you how many times per minute it occurred. And here's an example of what that data might look like. And this is straight out of your book. So we're looking at how often is the student asking, in this case, how often is the student asking questions directed to peers? And one of the things we're going to think about is that we want this number to increase, because what we're trying to teach the student to do is to ask peers questions. We're looking at that social interaction, for example. Maybe we're looking at some kind of conversation where we're doing an exchange, and we want you to ask questions, not only talk about what you're interested in. And so when we look at our first data session, which occurred between 9:10 and 11:15, the student asked one question every 25 minutes. And so again, I took the number of occurrences, divided it by the number of minutes, and that told me 1 minute, one question every 5 minutes. And remember, we want this to increase. We want the number of questions to go up. So in the second data session, the student asked one question every 23.3 minutes. So he's asking questions more often, but just a little bit, right? And then when we look at that third session, because each of these times is different, this one is from 9:10 to 11:15, so that's a longer period of time, which is why we have to calculate each of the sessions. In that third session, the student asked one question every 10 minutes. And again, we are looking for more frequent questions and an increase in the number of questions. So what I want you to do now is I want you to look at the data and I want you to determine what type of instructional decision would you make? Would you continue instruction as it is? Would you stop instruction? Has the student mastered this and they're ready to move to another skill? Do you need to modify your instruction? There are other options, but those are just a couple. So go ahead, stop the video, and then I want you in your Word document to just write down, you can just put down free operant assessment, and then what decision, database decision would you make based on this data? Go ahead and stop your video. All right, let's keep moving. So the next type of data collection we're going to talk about is trial-based, and this would be for a trial-based assessment. And so when we're looking at trial-based, we're looking at some kind of a discrete response. So it's a response where I say, what word? And the student says dog. There's just one response. There's not a chain. There's no steps to it. That's a discrete response. And so when we're looking at trial-based, we're looking at discrete responses after some kind of very specific cue or event. So if, for example, when I said what word, there's a very specific response I'm looking for. And the type of data we would be collecting here would be the percentage, and that might be something like the teacher records the number of responses, correct responses, when the students ask comprehension questions that are shared, are asked during a shared reading activity. So the student's been asked 5 comprehension questions, they got 3 correct, and then we're going to determine the percentage, and in that case, it would be 60%. Another type of data, trial-based data, would be rate. And again, this is looking at how quickly how many times a student does something within a specific period. And so a teacher might record the number of, let's say, simple addition problems that a student completes in a minute. And oftentimes with that, we use rate when we're looking at fluency. We want to see the student initially was able to do uh, 2 problems per minute, and now they're able to do 6 problems per minute. We can see an increase in their fluency and the rate with which they're able to solve those problems. So here is an example of trial-based data. And what we can see is that on each data session, the student had 5 trials, and we can see that right down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in this one, they were looking at accurate construction of sentences. So this would be looking for complete sentences and the components that they had identified. And so when we look at this, we would say that in the first data session, the student correctly constructed sentences, accurately constructed sentences in 3 out of 5 trials. And so that would be 60%. The same thing happened in the second data session, 60%, 3 out of 5 trials. Now we see in data sessions 3 and 4 that the student got 4 out of 5 for 80% in each of those trials. Now, before I get you to analyze that data and to determine what you would do next instructionally, I want you just to stop and think, because one of the things that I've talked about a moment ago is that we use parents. Parents are really important part of our team. And so when we report data to parents, we really want to think about what's easiest for them to understand. Is 3 out of 5 opportunities easier to understand, or is 60% easier to understand? And I'm not telling you which one to use. I'm just trying to get you in the mindset of thinking when I'm engaging with others, such as parents, but it could again be an administrator that you're engaging with, or your paraprofessionals. What's easiest to understand when I'm reporting data? And so now what I want you to do is I want you to look at the data, do a quick analysis of the data, and tell me what type of instructional data-based decision would you make based on the data that we have here. So stop the video, write that down, and then we'll come back and look at it in class. All right. I am sure after taking an ABA course and having taken a previous curriculum course that you are well versed in task analysis. And with the population that we work with, task analysis is something you will use every day, multiple times in your classroom. So now what we're going to do is look at task analytic assessment and the data that you would collect for that. So when we're looking at a task analytic assessment, that's really just some kind of skill that involves a chain or steps that a student needs to go through to complete a more complex task like hand washing or long division, simple addition. All of those have steps that a student has to go through in order to complete the full task. And so when you're collecting that data, you might collect data on just a single opportunity. And it might be something like you're teaching a student to cook a new type of food. And so you're collecting data on the steps that the student can complete correctly when engaging in this unfamiliar cooking task. And you're collecting data until the student is unable to perform a step. So they're able, let's say, to get out the ingredients for the cooking. They're able to measure like a solid, something like flour, for example, using a measuring cup. However, once they get to a liquid with the measuring cup, they're not able to do that step. When we're doing a single opportunity, we're just going to stop right there. We're going to terminate the assessment. And now that is what we're going to say is the student is able to complete steps 1 through 4, but then when they get to step 5, that's where they're not able to perform the task, and that's going, or that step, and that's going to inform your instruction. Or you might do a multiple opportunity. And in this case, it might be that a paraprofessional is working with a student on a writing task. And the writing task is that they're writing a sentence that has a subject, a verb, and an object, for example. And so the paraprofessional is going to give the student the opportunity to write. Once the student makes an error, the paraprofessional is going to mark that data. There is an error on the second word, which might be the verb, for example. They're going to score that error. The paraprofessional is then going to write the correct word, and they're going to wait for the student then to write the following word. And so that's just some a simple error correction. But again, the student might have multiple opportunities. And if you make an error, we're just going to go in and complete that step for you and then allow you to continue with the next step in the chain. So here is an example of some task analytic assessment. And you can see this is the steps in sending a text, and there were 5 steps in total. So if we look at our data, we can see that in the first data session, the student was at 20%. The second session, they were at 40%. Sessions 3 and 4, they were at 80%. And then sessions 5 and 6, they were at 100%. So I want you to analyze this data and then write down and share your thoughts when you stop the video. But what you also have to think about in this one, because I know everybody's going to look and they're going to see, oh, he's at 100%. You also have to think about your criterion, right? So if you had a student who you were teaching to send a text, what would your criterion for mastery be? So that's something else just as you're analyzing data to keep in your thoughts. So what I want you to do now is to look at the data, analyze it, and then write down what type of database decision you would make. So go ahead and stop the video and do that now. All right, let's keep going. The next one is something that in education we are all very familiar with, and that is a permanent product scoring. And a permanent product is exactly what it sounds like. It is something that you could hold in your hand or you could see that never is going to go away. It could be a worksheet, it could be a video a student made a diorama or a poster related to something, for example, that they were learning in science. And so when you are collecting data on a permanent product, most often you're looking at the percentage correct, the number, perhaps the number of components that they got correct, or you're using something like a rubric to rate the student's work. And so it might be something like the teacher counts the number of words that the student matched correctly with their definition, and they had a worksheet and they had to put the word here and then they had to glue the definition beside it. That would be a permanent product. And you could either look at the number correct, or most often we're going to look at the percentage correct. Another example might be that we have a student who is not a manual writer, but they still need to sign things. They still need to put their signature on legal documents. So let's say that it is a student who is independent and does not have guardianship after they graduate, and they have their own self-determination, self-agency, and they're able to sign their own documents. And so you might use a rubric for that student when you're teaching them how to use a stamp, like a rubber stamp signature, because that's oftentimes what many individuals who are not manual writers do. And so you might use a rubric, and in the rubric, the student's going to get 4 points if their name is neat, legible, and complete. But they're only going to get 3 points if the name is legible, but it's like slightly smeared or it's faint. They didn't push down hard enough. So those might be some examples of permanent products. So this time what I want you to do is I want you not only to think about what the next instructional step you would take, because in this case I'm not giving you data. I want you to think about for this permanent product, what would your data sheet look like? And then based just on these two samples, examples of student work, what would you do? What would your instructional decision be? So first take a second and I want you to look at this. The student was supposed to write the sentence, or what the task direction was. It would have been write a sentence about what you're studying, and they were studying about poetry. So what the student should have written, the correct response was, I'm studying about poetry, and then a period. But as we can see, our student wrote, I'm studying about, period. There was something missing, right? It was poetry. Now, and that might be a sentence that they wrote at the beginning of a lesson or beginning of a unit, for example. And then our second sentence that the student was supposed to write in the task direction would have been write a sentence about what you learned, is the student would have written or should have written, the correct response was, I learned about poetry, period. And as we can see, the student wrote, I learned a period. So we can see there's an error there. So I want you to stop for just a second and think, what type of data sheet would you use for this? All right. Well, this permanent product came from a research study that we recently did, and this is how we collected data. So we collected data on the inclusion, the correct response for each individual word plus the period, because we were teaching sentence construction. And so it was either you got I'm right or you didn't. And if you didn't, we would just show you the answer, because in this case, the controlling prompt was a model. We would show the students the answer and then give them the opportunity to write the second word, which would be studying. If they got studying correct, we would give them a check. If not, we gave them an X. But if you didn't think this way, it's okay, because this is only one way that you could have collected data. We could have made the decision, or you could make the decision, that I'm going to score it on correct as a complete sentence or not. Either you got the whole sentence correct or you didn't. So that's another way that you could have collected data on this. Again, there are different ways. I'm just showing you one example. So based on what you see here in this permanent product, what type of instructional decision would you have made based on the student's permanent product? Go ahead and stop the video and then come back after you answer. All right, let's keep moving. Next, we're going to talk about timing. And a lot of times you're going to have students who are going to engage in behaviors that are short, that are long, that take the whole time you're teaching. Sometimes it's just little portions of the time that you're teaching their responses. And so we want to look at timing. And there are different types of data that we might collect for timing. For example, one might be the total duration, the total amount of time in which the student was demonstrating a skill. And an example of this might be that if a student is engaging in play in close proximity to a peer, maybe they're playing not with the peer, but they're playing beside the peer. And that's what we want. We want them closer. We're slowly scaffolding to get them closer and closer to engaging with the peer. How long did the student engage in play in close proximity to a peer? We're looking at the time that it started and the time that they stopped playing in close proximity, and that tells us the total duration. Another might be duration per occurrence. So in this one, and you're going to see the word tantrum in here, and that is not a word that I typically look at. I don't typically say that a student is engaged in a tantrum. However, we did put this in here because sometimes you're engaging in conversations with parents, and sometimes you might use the same language that the parent uses because you are working as a team and they are also collecting data for you at home. I encourage you to work with your parents and also teach them how to collect data so you can see how the student is generalizing skills or performing skills across different contexts. So let's say that in this case, we are collecting data on how long the student is engaged in a tantrum or in some type of a challenging behavior because we want to know, is it decreasing over time? We have a behavior intervention plan that we're working with them on, and we want to know, is it effective? And so we're looking at each occurrence of a student engaging in that challenging behavior. And we're looking at how long did each of those occurrences last. And then finally, you might be collecting data on latency recording, on latency. And what that is from the time that, let's say that you give a direction, a task direction, and the amount of time it takes for the student to actually start that task. And so it might be that the teacher's recording latency data on the amount of time it takes for a student to start working once they've entered a job site. So once you get there, let's say that the cue, the specific cue that you're responding to is walking in the door of your business. Because when we're looking at timing, we're looking at things that have various lengths of time or things that don't happen really quickly after a cue is given. So once you walk into the building, how long does it actually take you to start your work? That's latency. And so you would record from the time they walk into the job site until when they start their actual job. The task related to their job would be latency. And so here are some examples of latency recording and duration recording and the data sheets that might be used. One of the things I do want to make sure that you notice is that when we have duration, we're looking at the time the behavior began right here and the time the behavior ended. And then we're recording how much time that was because that's the duration that the student engaged. In this case, it would be in on-task behavior. When we're looking at latency, we're looking at the time, writing down the time that the direction was given, and then the time that the student started the task. And then what we're going to calculate what that length of time was, and that tells us the latency for the student. And that's how we're going to make database decisions and progress monitor. All right, on to another type of data. This one is called time sampling. And so with time sampling, we're looking at behaviors that occur continuously. They just keep going, or they occur so frequently that I'm not able to accurately measure that. And so there are different types of data, and this again should be a review from your ABA course. But the first one is whole interval recording. And so if I were to take a period of time that I'm teaching, the length of time my lesson, for example, lasts, and it's 30 minutes, so taking a 30-minute time period, and I divide that into 1-minute intervals, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to record whether the student is on task for the entire interval for each of those intervals. So is the student on task for minute 1 for the whole minute, for minute 2 for the whole minute, and it would either be yes or no. The second type of data is partial interval recording. And with this one, again, taking that same 30-minute period that's divided into 1-minute intervals. And this time I'm going to record, for example, whether the student is picking at their fingernails at any time in the interval. If in that interval it happens at 2 seconds, yes, the student did it within that interval. Now, let's say for interval two, minute number two, it happens at 30 seconds. Yes, it happened in that interval. And then finally, we're looking at momentary time sampling. So this time we're taking a 30-minute time period, we're dividing it into 2-minute intervals. And what we want to know is the student in their seat, because we're looking at student remaining in their seat, are they in the seat at the end of each interval? So once I hit 1 minute exactly, I'm looking up. Is the student in their seat? Yes or no? Now I'm looking away. At minute two, I'm looking up. Is the student in their seat? Yes or no? And then I'm looking away because I'm only doing it at the very end of the interval. So this is the example that was given in the book, and what it showed was that out of a total of 27 intervals, for 45% of those intervals, the student was engaged in whatever behavior they were showing. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at the second data sheet, and this is a real data sheet, and it's from a consultation we did with a school for a student with autism, and they wanted to increase his engagement. And so, what I want you to do is to look at this time sampling, and this was momentary time sampling. So, in the first minute, every 10 seconds, we were looking up to see was the student engaged. Now, you're not always doing it that quickly. We were working with this school and we needed very sensitive data to see if he was engaged or not. And so we were doing it on a 10-second interval, but then analyzing it within a minute. So what I want you to do is to determine what percentage of intervals was the student engaged in the first three 5-minute intervals. So if you look at intervals 1 through 5, what percentage was he engaged? And with this one, anytime you see a check, the student was engaged. It doesn't matter what the code is beside it. Anytime there's a check, he was engaged. If there's just a P or there's just an O, that means the student was not engaged at that time. That means he was engaged with a peer or he was engaged with an object, not in the instruction. So go ahead and stop the video, and then I want you to calculate, analyze, and then calculate a percentage for each of those 5-minute intervals from 1 to 5, from 6 to 10, and then from 11 to 15. So go ahead and stop your video, then come back, and we will look at this again in class. All right. So there are some common problems with data collection. These are things that you really have to look out for. And one of them is really paying attention and putting great importance on accurate data. Because when you have inaccurate data, here it says it can lead to harmful instructional decisions. For example, my data is inaccurate, but it says you have mastered this skill and I'm going to move on to the next skill. That's harmful if your data is inaccurate and the student has not mastered the skill yet. You're moving on before they have true mastery because of inaccurate data. Equally as detrimental is your data is inaccurate and it says your student has not mastered the skill, but they have. And now they're sitting through instruction that is not necessary because of inaccurate data rather than moving on to the next skill. And so teachers have to really ensure that the data that they have is accurate because we need a true representation of what our students' performance is because that data is what everything we do is based on. Another issue is it's measurement concerns. And so there's something called misleading data patterns due to the method or timing of measurement. So what does that mean? Well, if you always collect data on your student being able to define their vocabulary words on Friday afternoon, is that data accurate? How do you feel on Friday afternoon? I know when I was a teacher, I was tired on Friday afternoon. I know that my students weren't performing at their best on Friday afternoon or Monday morning necessarily. So, if I always collect data on a student's ability to define their vocabulary words on Friday afternoon, there are some real concerns around the accuracy of of that data. And so you really have to very carefully determine not only your data collection measure, because the data you collect has to reflect what the skill is that you're assessing, but you really have to be very careful with the schedules with which you're collecting data. Don't collect data on the same day at the same time every week. What is the student able to do on a Monday and on a Tuesday? Because again, there can be outside factors that affect the accuracy of your data when you don't vary that or pay close attention to, for example, the schedule of your data collection. Another problem is something called observer drift. And what this means is that the assessor, the person who's collecting data, gradually changes the way they're scoring over time. And what they end up doing is moving away from whatever the behavioral definition was, and they start accepting approximations. And so, just a quick example might be that I am collecting data on, let's go back to students' engagement in the lesson. And so, initially, I'm looking at, because we have defined it as the student is sitting in their seat, they are facing the direction of instruction, their eyes are on the teacher, and they are responding to instructional directions or task directions. So, let's just say that's how we've defined engagement. And initially, that's what I'm collecting data on. Is the student engaged in all four of those components? But then what I start to see is that the student starts to fidget with something. And when they're playing with their fidget, they're looking away. Their eyes are not at the point of instruction. But what I notice is it only lasts just a second, two, three at most. And so then they look back up and I'm not having to say anything to them. And then suddenly I start counting that as engagement without really realizing that no, they're engaged, then they're disengaged for a few seconds, and then they're re-engaging. And every time they're focused on that fidget, that is not engagement. But I have now started to accept an approximation of what engagement might be. So it's really important that we train all of our staff, anybody that's going to be collecting data, parents as well, that first we model the data collection. This is what it actually looks like. Then we give them the opportunity to rehearse that data collection with us observing, and that we then give them feedback on their data collection. Yes, you did this great. This is perfect. Or actually, this is not correct. And let me tell you why. Let me show you again how to collect that data. Because it's really important that we have procedural fidelity with data collection. And so you need to regularly collect that procedural fidelity. And so, one of the things you can also do to ensure that your data is accurate is that you can do what's called inter-observer agreement. And what that means is that it's a way for two people to collect data on the same behavior at the same time, or it could be for a video. If you do a video, it might be later. But two people are collecting data on the same behavior, and you want to make sure that that aligns. So let's say, for example, we have a 5-step task analysis for texting, and I come back and say, hey, I got that the student got 3 out of 5 steps correct. They got steps 1, 2, and 3. And then the other data collector says, I got 3 right. I got that they got 3 correct as well. And they also got 1, 2, and 3 steps correct for me. That data aligns. And so that's a way for me to check accuracy. And I might do that. I'm going to do that periodically, because the next time it may be that I say, hey, guess what? He got 3 out of 5 correct. He got 1, 2, and 3 correct. But then the other person says, well, you know what? He got 3 out of 5 correct for me, but he got 1, 3, and 5. Our data does not align. Our data is not, somebody's data is not accurate, because when we collected data on the same behavior at the same time, we did not have the same results. And so again, it's just a way to make sure that you are collecting data and that your data is accurate. Again, just as a reminder, you need to know this information, but I'm sure that you are all happy to hear that it will not be on your systematic instruction quiz. All right, we'll stop right there and I will see you in the next video.